Greetings, this is Griff Ruby with part 6 of my series, Foundation's Progress, the story of Dr. Asimov's writing of the Foundation series. So, I'm going to pick up at a reasonable place here, where we left off before. Okay, on page 482 of In Memory Yet Green, he states, on September 9, 1946, I went to see Campbell and brought up Little Lost Robot for further discussion. I had made 2 false starts. Campbell pressed to have me try again, and we even discussed 2 more Foundation stories. 2 more. Later that year, he would begin the next Foundation piece. Given that he would write his next part intending it to be his last, one has to wonder what plot elements are then intended for the 2 more Foundation stories. That the first would involve some direct confrontation between the Mule and the second Foundation was obvious enough, given the previous storyline. But what might have been intended for the final part in that discussion? But as there did end up being 2 more installments, perhaps Campbell felt entitled to 2 more installments on the strength of that discussion, hence pressing Asimov into writing the 2 final parts. Despite his appreciation, and that of his readers, of the Mule as a segment, he had grown wearied and tired of the series, again feeling that he had written himself into something of a corner. Obviously, the second Foundation would have to take on the Mule and defeat him. His solution was to write only one last installment and call it quits. Stitching together several separate accounts as contained in the early Asimov, page 470, In Memory Yet Green, pages 494 to 495, and the story behind the Foundation, the following account of the writing of that penultimate installment goes like this. Quote, after I got out of the Army, it became difficult to find time to write. Toward the end of 1946, I managed to begin another Foundation story, Now You See It. I finished it on February 2, 1947, and submitted it to Campbell on the 4th. It was 25,000 words long, only half as long as The Mule, but it still took me several months to complete. By that time, I was rather sick of the Foundation series, and I tried to write Now You See It in such a way as to make it the last of the series. On February 4, I visited Campbell and handed over Now You See It. For the first time, Campbell was not completely satisfied with the Foundation story. We disagreed on the ending. I had grown a little weary of the Foundation and all its works. I had been working on it on and off for 5 years. I had written 7 stories totaling about 185,000 words. I felt it was time to end the thing and get on to something new. Therefore, I rounded off Now You See It in such a way as to make it a reasonable ending of the series. I tried to end them by setting up and solving the mystery of the location of the second Foundation. Campbell would have none of it. After he read the story, he told me I could not use the ending as I had it. I had to revise the ending to permit a sequel, making it open-ended to continue the series. He was quite firm about it, and I still wasn't in any position to brave Campbell's displeasure. Campbell was the kind of editor who could not be denied. So I would write only 1 more Foundation story, vowing to myself that it would be the last. He forced me to change the ending and made me promise that I would do that 1 more Foundation story. So I wrote, Now You See It, according to instructions, the task taking me but a day, and brought it in again on the 10th. Campbell accepted the new version at once, and on February 14, 1947, a check for $500 arrived. It came on the 5th anniversary of my blind date with Gertrude. So, the revision was, of course, that instead of having Rossum be the actual world of the second Foundation, hiding it near, but not on to Zenda itself, Star's End, as plausibly one might expect a local name to be distorted over the centuries, it was moved somewhere else. For a brief moment, the Mule would know where the second Foundation was, Now You See It, but then the first speaker would remove all interest in it from his mind, and now you don't. Obviously, he was still thinking in terms of the second Foundation's base planet as being physically located at the other end of the galaxy, or at least very nearly so. He had revised it, as he says, in 1 single day, and it would have taken a far more substantial revision than that to remove the second Foundation from its real planetary base as finally published to Zenda or some other world near it. Given this, it has to be clear that hiding the second Foundation where it finally went had to have come rather late in writing this series. With that one revision, it could not be on Tazenda or Rossum, but he had a couple of years with which to come up with a far cleverer place for it. One other installment would now be needed to finish out the Foundation series as originally conceived, concluding with the giving away of the location of some far more cleverly hidden place for the second Foundation, along with creatively different interpretations of the name, Star's End, and the phrase at the opposite end of the galaxy. By this point, the pleasure had gone entirely out of writing Foundation stories, but at least there was a clear agreement that the next part would be his last, at least for a very, very long time. On November 18, 1947, the December 1947 issue of Astounding hit the newsstands, announcing the next Foundation story to appear in the January 1948 issue, which was released December 16, 1947. So he says, next month we have a yarn that has been asked about a number of times. It's called Now You See It, ... Hasn't been asked for by name, of course, but it's Isaac Asimov's sequel to The Mule, and concerns itself with the second Foundation. It was natural enough that the Mule wouldn't give up with only one try at finding it, and it was equally natural that the second Foundation would not be at all anxious to meet the Mule and his powers both mental and purely physical, with the huge weight of arms and armor he had behind him by that time. Finding a needle in a haystack is supposed to be tough, but it gets tougher when the needle is doing its best to make like a strand of hay. Oh, and while making like a strand of hay, keeping its point well sharpened. So, the 24,089-word story finally appeared with the following page order. The Mule had to find that second Foundation, and because of his power, the second Foundation couldn't let him. But because he ruled most of the galaxy and had certain special powers, the Mule wasn't easily stopped. Analytics for Now You See It shows that it took first place with a score of 1.33. All that was left now was to write that final installment for John Campbell. I weave in a couple details from the early Asimov, page 560, and the story behind the Foundation, to excerpts from the account in Memory at Green, pages 540, 545, and 554. So, quote, well, Campbell was the kind of editor who could not be denied, so I wrote one more Foundation story, vowing to myself that it would be the last. I still felt that I could find no security in my writing. 1948 had been a disappointing year. He had written his novel Grow Old with me, but no one was interested in publishing it despite all the places he had sold his previous stories. Though I was working on And Now You Don't, which had the potential of earning me a large check, I disliked it intensely. I found working on it very difficult. Campbell was interested in the Foundation series. He had been sending me several letters while I was working on Mother Earth, asking me to finish it and start another Foundation tale. During our session on October 12, we discussed my idea on this, and I finally persuaded him to let me reveal the whereabouts of the second Foundation. He did so on condition that I make the story 50,000 words long, so that he could run it as a serial. I suppose he suspected from my attitude that the new story would be the last of the Foundation series, and he wanted to end it on a high note. I agreed to call it And Now You Don't, to tie in with the title of the previous Foundation story, which I had completed 1 3/4 years before. I began And Now You Don't on October 16, and from the very start I knew I would have trouble. You see, each Foundation story assumes as a background all the previous stories, but I couldn't assume that every reader had read and remembered all the rest. Therefore, each story had to manage to explain everything that had happened before, and as the series grew longer and more complex, this became more difficult. And Now You Don't began with a teenage girl reciting the previous events as part of a school assignment. I managed to work it in, but I decided it would have to be the last time. I had no sooner sold Mother Earth than I began a new Foundation story entitled And Now You Don't. It was to be the last. Like The Mule, it was 50,000 words long, and I didn't finish it until March 29, 1949. I submitted it to Campbell the next day, and he accepted it at once. So on March 31, Campbell took And Now You Don't, and at 2 cents a word, it netted me a check for $1,000 that came on April 5. It was the most I had ever gotten for a single piece of writing, and was in fact the first four-figure check I had ever received, and the largest check I had ever seen. The story was, however, the last of the Foundation series, which I had been working on now on and off for 7.5 years, and which included 8 stories that had earned me a total of just over $3,600. I had gone through too much drama on And Now You Don't to continue the series. I had spent too much time, far too much, on working out twists in the plot that would fit what had gone before. I think by that time even Campbell realized that I had had enough, though I'm sure that if he could have had his way, he would have had me work on the Foundation forever, since there was no question that the stories were crowd pleasers. It appears that he intended that this final story, actually slightly shorter than the Mule, would also have something of a cliffhanger halfway through, since the middle installment, things end on a low pass, in which Arcady, fleeing the Second Foundation and eager to avoid any trap they may have set for her by not knowing where to turn or where to go or who to trust, is deposited alone and frightened and confused in a spaceport on a planet far away from home. But this final story was instead divvied up into 3 parts, concealing this would-be cliffhanger in the middle of the middle part. With the final Foundation installments written and all in press, but not having appeared yet, Asimov did have an opportunity to observe the deep appreciation the readers had already formed for his Foundation series, as he reports in Memory at Green, page 568. We met Morris and Lillian Cohen, who were a particularly pleasant couple. He was short and bald, she short and blonde, both highly articulate. They were celebrating their 16th wedding anniversary. We grew friendly with them when I noticed Maury, as we came to call him, carrying a copy of the current Astounding. He didn't know who I was, since it was customary at resorts to use first names only as another way of shutting out the real world, and I felt safe and unembarrassing to ask if he had read any of the stories of the Foundation series. "Oh yes," he said. "They are very good, and the author is your namesake. He's Isaac, also. His last name is also a namesake of mine, for my last name is Asimov, just as his is." After that, we were inseparable. This was in August of 1949, with the final 3 installments of the Foundation series yet to appear just 2 months later. Clearly, even before ever appearing in book form, the Foundation series had already made quite an impression, at least on readers. But when little brown editor Jane Lawson took Isaac Asimov out to an expensive lunch to discuss prospective book contracts, the Foundation series had not inspired her to have sufficient interest in the Foundation series. As given in Memory at Green, page 569, quote, "During the lunch, I tried to toot my Foundation series, and later on I brought her all the manuscripts. Alas, she didn't want them, and after reading them, handed them back." End quote. On October 18, the November issue arrived at the newsstands. There had been no announcement of the coming Asimov Foundation installment. This was followed with the December 1949 and January 1950 issues, which became available on November 15 and December 20, 1949. The page blurbs for each of these issues read, "It was an inevitable but not quite inescapable conflict. The first Foundation had to find the second Foundation. The second Foundation had to prevent it or die." And the next one, second of 3 parts. "It can't be seen and must be found, with one small girl and a few bold men to seek the menace." And then, conclusion, for stability, the Foundation had to find and extirpate the second Foundation. For success, the second Foundation had to let them. And for survival, the second Foundation couldn't permit it, of course. Analytics for the 3 parts of the 47,174-word final installment show that the first took second place with a score of 2.33, the second took second place with a score of 2.27, and the third took first place with a score of 2.0. The series was now complete and fully in print. The 1950s were to be a new decade with new ideas and potentials, but as for Isaac Asimov, he was sure that it was time to leave the agonies of writing Foundation stories back in the 1940s. Or so it seemed. There had been one effort to see about publishing at least some portion of the Foundation series on Doubleday, even though Asimov had not as of yet established any relationship with them, as reported in Memory at Green, page 545. Fred Pohl told me that Doubleday was thinking of putting out a line of science fiction stories, and he wondered whether they might be interested in the Mule. I didn't mind having him check the matter, and I gave him copies of Astounding that contained the story. Unfortunately, that came to nothing also. Well, I'm going to cut off this part here.